You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
We turn now to our fourth and final panel of guests. Ralph Martire is with the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Andrew Nelms is with Americans for Prosperity. We're going to get to you both. I want to start with you, Ralph. The CTBA says a graduated income tax would help eliminate some of the long-term structural flaws that have consistently made Illinois' overall tax system one of the most unfair and poorly performing in the nation. Most Republicans and Democrats would agree on that last part, that the state's fiscal situation is one of the poorest in the nation. But what does that first part mean, those long-term structural flaws, and how would a graduated income tax solve that?
Yeah, so I mean, it all comes down to fundamental tax policy. So in addition to working at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, I'm a professor at Roosevelt University. I actually teach a master's course on tax policy. And so the income tax, just like the other taxes, has a very specific role to play in your tax system. In the case of any state tax system, the income tax has two jobs, really. Job number one, offset the natural regressivity of every other tax and fee imposed at the state or local level. Literally, every other tax available to state and local government is regressive. It takes more of the income of a low or moderate earning family's earnings than it does out of a more affluent family. The only tax that can counter that by design would be the income tax, but not one with a flat rate. Because if you have a flat rate income tax, you leave that natural regressivity in place for every other tax and fee. So you need a graduated rate structure so you can intentionally shift some tax burden from low and moderate earning families to more affluent families. So there's structural flaw number one, and that's why Illinois consistently has one of the most unfair, as in regressive, taxing systems in the entire country. Number two, the income tax is supposed to respond to how incomes are distributed in the modern economy and raise revenue appropriately based on this distribution. Well, if you look at income distribution in Illinois over the last 40 years, the wealthiest 1% in our state have seen their average incomes increase from $411,000 a year to $1.4 million. Meanwhile, the bottom 99% of earners in Illinois have seen their average incomes increase from $51,000 to $61,000. No tax can respond to that huge disparity in income growth except the income tax, but then only if it has a graduated rate structure. And since ours does not, our tax can't impose higher rates on higher levels of income, so we miss where the economy is growing over time. And that results in an underperforming revenue system. And if you look at the data, our tax revenue in our general fund hasn't grown in real inflation-adjusted terms in the last 2 decades. And part of the reason is this flaw, this inability of the income tax to do what it's supposed to do, and that is generate additional revenue by having higher rates on these higher levels of income.
Andrew, I want to turn to you. He makes an interesting point that as the economy grows, the state of Illinois' tax code is not positioned best to capture some of that growth. And in fact, property values, property taxes in Illinois are the highest or second highest in the nation. Governor Pritzker earlier this week made the argument that if the state pays more share into local education, then local school districts would not feel that need to raise property taxes. Perhaps there would be property tax relief there. Do you buy that argument, Andrew? Do you see the possibility that more state funding for education could mean lower property taxes over the long haul?
Well, I think everybody is in agreement that property taxes, or crippling property taxes, is one of the issues, one of the most troubling issues facing the state of Illinois. And of course, we all want property tax relief, but simply hiking taxes in this manner in particular is not the way to go about it. We've talked about Illinois' economy, and as Moody's pointed out in a report that they prepared for one of the legislative commissions earlier this year, put it this way, that, quote, the vibrant national economy is enticing more of the state's residents to seek opportunities elsewhere. And in the past few years, the gap has widened as an underperforming Illinois economy has reduced the state's appeal compared with the rest of the country. Now, we need to keep in mind that as a state, Illinois lagged the nation in our recovery from the Great Recession and will likely lag the nation again in our recovery from the pandemic. And the proponents, like Professor Martire, talk about fairness and remedying regressivity. But first of all, there's already a lot of progressivity in the tax code. In fact, the bottom fifth of taxpayers pay a mere 1.5% of their income towards the state income tax, but the rates that the legislature passed and that would go into effect if this amendment were ratified have been called, quote, particularly ungenerous to the poorest Illinoisans, because under this rate schedule, you would pay on your very first dollar a mere 1/5% less than we currently pay, in exchange for handing the legislature greater latitude to levy higher taxes. To me, sounds like a bad deal for middle-class families. Keep in mind that a taxpayer with a taxable income of $50,000 has paid $8,000 in additional state income tax as a result of the two massive income tax hikes of the last decade, and that doesn't include their crippling property tax burden and the hundreds of dollars a year that they'll pay in additional gas tax after Governor Pritzker championed a doubling of the gas tax last year to give us the third highest gas tax in the nation. And so if people were genuinely concerned about the least among us, they would be paying less. The only reason that anybody can say that anybody would be paying the same or less under these rates is because of the last tax hike. Absolutely nobody would be paying less than we were all paying just a few years ago.
Andrew, the arguments that you made about Illinois' inability to climb out of a fiscal hole even while the economy was soaring, couldn't that be evidence or proof positive that the flat tax structure and system wasn't serving Illinois well?
Well, no, we all know that Illinois suffers from two chronic and persistent ailments: fiscal mismanagement and corruption. Now, under this proposal, the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation recently cautioned that Illinois would have one of the most uncompetitive business climates in the entire nation. And so why in the world, at a time when we're struggling to recover, why would we put ourselves yet again at a comparative disadvantage as compared to other states in the nation? This plan would give Illinois the second highest corporate income tax rate in the nation, as a for instance, double that of neighboring Indiana. And so absolutely not. I do not think that putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage and giving ourselves one of the most uncompetitive business climates in the nation is going to be helpful.
Ralph, most people agree, and Governor Pritzker has said there's really only three ways out of the state's fiscal problems. It's cut spending, raise taxes somewhere, or grow the economy. On that third portion, grow the economy, what would be the impact? And can you respond to Andrew's point there that raising the corporate income tax would depress job growth or job creation? What do you think the effect would be of raising the corporate income tax?
Okay, so there's never been any statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and your tax rates and your economic growth. In fact, if you go back the last decade and you look at the 9 states in America with the highest income tax rates, the highest rates, and you compare them to the 9 states in America that have no income tax at all. So you're talking Texas, Florida, North Dakota, Nevada, et cetera, all these states the anti-tax folks say are great economic states. The high tax states outperform them on a statistically significant basis in everything from GDP growth per capita to personal income growth to disposable personal income growth. That is your income after taxes and in consumption. So all these arguments just don't hold water once you compare them to the data. That is number one. Number two, Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz looked at those states that raised taxes progressively during the Great Recession and maintained or enhanced their spending on services as a way to deal with the budget deficits created during the Great Recession versus those states that implemented an austerity program and cut spending. And what he specifically found was that in each instance, those states that raised taxes progressively and used that money to invest in core services recovered faster and grew their economies faster than those states that resorted to austerity. Now, why would that be? And the answer is consumer spending. So consumer spending accounts for 67% of all economic activity at the state or federal level. And what happens when you tax the wealthiest in Illinois is they don't reduce their consumer spending. And let me give you some numbers here. Between 2016 and 2017, The wealthiest 3% in Illinois saw their incomes grow after taxes in that one-year sequence by $16 billion. It is that wealthiest 3% that will pay the entire tax increase under the Fair Tax Initiative. So if this law was in place then, their taxable incomes, net incomes would have grown by over $12 billion. They wouldn't be harmed in any way, and they would maintain their consumption patterns. However, the new revenue raised from this legislation would then be invested in what the state spends its money on, where 95 cents out of every dollar go to education, healthcare, human services, and public safety. And it's really covering the salaries of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers and the correctional officers who provide those services. Well, guess what? Those are middle income folks who have very high propensities to consume. That is, with every dollar they earn or additional dollar they earn, they tend to spend it in the local economy. So the net impact of this, Stiglitz found, is you get a multiplier in the kind of situation that's created by the fair tax, where you raise revenue only progressively and you invest it in core services of anywhere up to $1.50 in your private sector for every dollar raised and spent in this fashion. And that just makes total sense. And if you look at Illinois' problems, in fact, economically, we have trailed the nation. But if you look at those things that state government has control over that have a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing your economic competitiveness over time, that policy is not one of them. There are only two. How well your state invests in education, and that is education writ large. That's early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. And how well your state invests in infrastructure. Nothing else has a statistically meaningful correlation. Well, Illinois underfunds its education system right now by some $7 billion. We underfund early childhood by at least $2.5 to close to $3 billion. We have cut our expenditures on higher ed over the last 20 years in real inflation adjusted terms by close to 48%. That has driven up the cost of tuition for public universities in our state at a rate that exceeds the national increase by 50 percentage points. You want to know why Illinois isn't competitive economically? Our state doesn't have adequate resources to invest in core services that have been shown, if you make these investments, to actually give your state a competitive advantage. That is our problem. It has always been a revenue problem. In fact, it has never been a spending problem. Illinois is spending 20% less today on education, health, social services, and public safety than it did 2 decades ago in the year 2000 after you adjust for inflation. We have made meaningful real cuts over these last decades because our revenue system performed so poorly in the modern economy, and it performed so poorly because our income tax cannot adjust to how incomes are distributed and respond to how incomes are distributed in the modern economy because we have a flat tax. That is a real problem just from a fiscal standpoint, and it has driven a lot of these other problems you see in the state. And so our property tax over-reliance, I think one area Andrew and I agree is the state over-relies on property taxes. Both of us have said that every time we've spoken together. But the reason we over-rely is very specifically education funding. A typical state covers only about 44% of the cost of public education from property taxes. Illinois covers 67%. That is number one in the country. That is why we are over-reliant on property taxes. A typical state pays about 46, almost 47% of the cost of public education from state-based resources. We pay 24%. That is 50th in the country. We will never be able to reduce our over-reliance on property taxes in the state until Illinois, from the state level, from its state resources, can make an adequate investment in education. And that is just what the numbers consistently show. And so how do low and moderate income families benefit from the fair tax? Well, I'll agree with Andrew. The tax relief it provides isn't significant, but we've always said that. This bill is not a tax relief bill. It's a revenue raiser. But what it does is it raises revenue only from those who can afford it. Now, in a flat tax, if you are stuck with a flat income tax, then you always have to tax your low and middle income families. That is unfair. How they will benefit, this additional revenue will help fund services in their communities, because one of the core principles of tax policy is wherever your needs are greatest, your resources are least. You need a mechanism in your tax policy to raise some revenue from individuals in areas of wealth so that you can invest that revenue in providing services in areas of need. We cannot do that with our current tax structure. We absolutely need to have a graduated rate system to respond to the monetary economy, and start generating adequate revenue.
I understand. Ralph, you mentioned earlier that Illinois has cut spending some 20% after you adjust for inflation over the last 20 years or so. Why then do you think Illinois has one of the highest total tax burdens, not just the income tax rate? We don't have the highest income tax.
So actually we don't, Mark. That's a really good point. And the only place I would recommend people look for this data is avoid organizations that have complex modeling and stuff, because your assumptions can jury rig your outcomes if you have an ideological basis. There's a source available on the internet called the Federation of Tax Administrators. All this federation does is it takes the audited numbers from state and local governments on the revenue they actually collect from all taxes and fees, and then it divides that amount. So it divides your total state and local revenue by what the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, says is your personal income in the state. And it comes up with tax burden as a percentage of income. Using this very simple math, which is accurate and allows you to compare apples to apples, Illinois ranks 33rd in the nation in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income, 33rd. We have the 6th largest population and the 5th largest economy. To call that high tax is just missing the point. A lot of people try to fool the general public talking about tax policy because they could focus on rates but ignore bases. And you got to look at tax policy including both. So for instance, the average sales tax rate in Illinois is relatively high. It's in the top 10 or 11 in the country. That said, our base, what we actually tax with these rates, is the lowest in the country. So Illinois raises significantly less sales tax revenue per capita than any other state in America with a sales tax because of the combination of these two factors. So that's why you really have to look all in. Total state and local tax burden, including every tax and fee charged by any unit of state and local government as a percentage of income. And then you see Illinois is very much not high tax, it is low tax, and it has always been low tax.
All right, Andrew, we're almost out of time. Final thoughts here. Can you respond to Ralph's suggestion there that putting more money in the pockets of people who have less income, they're at the bottom income levels, we know that the economy responds well to consumer confidence, consumer spending, a big part of the economic outlook. How do you evaluate the economic upside of people who make less having a little bit more disposable income?
Mark, I would love for middle and low income families in Illinois to have more disposable income, which is why we opposed both of the two massive income tax hikes and the extraordinarily regressive doubling of the gasoline tax last year. Again, as I mentioned, a taxpayer with $50,000 in taxable income is now paying over $8,000 more in state income tax. That doesn't include property taxes, doesn't include gasoline tax or the increase in the vehicle registration fee. But as a firm believer in our free enterprise system, I believe that there are, of course, two ways to increase revenue. You can either raise taxes, as has been done in the past and as the proponents wish to do today, or you can expand the total amount of taxable income. You grow the pie, not the government's piece of the pie. And I appreciate Professor Martire emphasizing that this isn't about, that the graduate income tax isn't about tax relief, because that seems to be one of the main tenets of the governor and some of the other proponents' arguments. And our concern is that these initial introductory rates aren't going to stay in effect for very long. In fact, during the debate in the legislature, one lawmaker stated outright that he did not think these rates were high enough. And Professor Martire's organization has promoted rate schedules that would raise taxes on far more than people who earn $250,000 a year or more. And then, of course, there's the concern about retirement tax. And the CTBA in March of last year published something that the headline of which is, quote, "It's time to tax retirement income, Illinois." And that called $50,000, quote, "quite a bit of retirement income." And so our concern is that these introductory initial rates aren't going to remain in effect for very long. But even at the get-go, right out of the gate, we'd have one of the most uncompetitive business climates in the nation, and that would adversely affect 100,000 small businesses. And of course, we also have to consider this in the context of current events. when lawmakers are being indicted and resigning in disgrace and pleading guilty to corruption charges, now seems like an awfully lousy time for Illinois politicians to be asking voters to trust them.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time, but Ralph and Andrew, thank you for joining us with your perspective on the policy impact on the graduated income tax. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
That does it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll be right back here again next week, the last Sunday before the election. For Capital Connection, I'm Mark Maxwell.